The servitor's augmetic I clicked 3 times before it spoke the words that would haunt Brother Sergeant Castor for the rest of his unnaturally long life. Gene seed deviation detected. Purity threshold exceeded. Initiating protocol excendio. In that moment, standing in the deepest vault of his chapter's fortress monastery, Castor understood why the chaplains had stopped meeting his gaze, why the apothecaries worked through the night behind sealed doors, why brothers who questioned too deeply disappeared into the lower sanctums and returned different. Every Space Marine chapter guards secrets that would shatter the Imperium's faith if revealed. Secrets written into their very genetic code, whispered in the shadows between their twin hearts. These are the truths that even the Adeptus Terra fears to document. The darkness that festers beneath ceramite and devotion. The price of creating angels from the flesh of men. Before we descend into these forbidden vaults together, where even the Inquisition treads carefully, consider supporting this chronicle of hidden truths. A simple activation of the notification rune, what you might call subscribing, ensures you'll receive each transmission as we uncover more buried histories. Share this data stream with those brave enough to face uncomfortable truths about humanity's greatest defenders. Now, let us pull back the veil on what really lies beneath the glory of the Adeptus Astartes. The smell hits you first when you enter the lower Mordekai levels of any fortress monastery, that particular mixture of counterseptic, preservation fluids, and something else that promethium flames can never quite burn away. Brother Apothecary Mordekai had grown accustomed to it over his 3 centuries of service to the Iron Hands, but he still remembered his first descent into these chambers as a neophyte, when the stench had made him vomit inside his helm. Now he moved through the processing halls with practiced efficiency, his mechadendrites whirring as they catalogued the day's harvest. 17 aspirants had entered the trial chambers at dawn. 3 had survived to reach the implantation theater. The other 14 lay here, on adamantium slabs that still bore the scratch marks of 10,000 previous occupants, their bodies systematically disassembled by servitors whose lower faces had been replaced with surgical arrays. Harvest the oculobe tissue from specimen 9, Mordekai instructed, his voice carrying through the vox grill with mechanical precision. The progenoid glands from specimen 12 show unusual development despite rejection syndrome. Mark them for tertiary cultivation. The servitors moved without acknowledgement, their lobotomized brains processing only the task, never the horror. But Mordekai knew. He knew that specimen 9 had been called Kelvin, that he'd come from the Forge World's lower hablocks with dreams of glory, that he'd lasted 43 hours into the trial before his body began rejecting the Laraman organ implant. The boy had screamed for his mother as his blood refused to clot, as his enhanced physiology turned against itself, as the very gifts meant to make him immortal instead tore him apart from within. Those screams were recorded, archived, studied. Every failure taught the apothecaries something new about the thin line between transformation and catastrophic biological cascade. The chapter needed every piece, every organ, every drop of gene-rich fluid that could be extracted. The mathematics of Space Marine creation were brutal in their simplicity. Each successful battle brother required the biological material of dozens of failures to sustain the gene seed banks, to provide practice organs for the apothecaries in training, to feed the cultivation systems that kept their chapter from the slow extinction that had claimed so many others. Mordekai paused at slab 7, where the youngest failure lay. 8 Terran years old, the minimum age for implantation, though most chapters preferred to wait until 10 or 12. This one, the data slate called him Aspirant 2847 Gamma, had suffered complete cardiovascular collapse when the secondary heart was introduced. His original heart sat in a preservation jar, waiting to be processed into the nutrient paste that would feed the next generation of implants. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. The Fortress Monastery's official records would state that unsuccessful aspirants died with honor in service to the chapter. The families, if they existed, would receive notice that their sons had been chosen for a greater purpose. They would never know about these chambers, where the honored dead became raw material, where young bodies were rendered down to their component purposes, where the sewers ran red with the runoff from processing vats that never stopped churning. Even most battle brothers remained ignorant of the full scope of operations here. They believed the gene seeds simply grew in sterile laboratories, carefully tended by the Mechanicum's arts. They never questioned where the biological scaffolding came from, what fed the organ looms, why the fortress monastery required such massive shipments of preserved human blood when their own Librarian cells made them nearly immune to bleeding. Mordekai descended deeper into the processing facility, past the primary extraction chambers where the newest failures were prepared, down to the secondary cultivation vaults where the real work happened. Here, the walls were lined with glass cylinders filled with murky amniotic solutions, each one containing partial organs in various stages of development. Failed progenoid glands floated like pale tumors, pulsing with artificial life, fed by tubes connected to larger vats where the processed remains of previous aspirants had been reduced to their base proteins. The Mechanicum called it biorecycling, but Mordekai knew it for what it was: cannibalism refined to industrial efficiency. Every space marine who had ever lived had consumed the flesh of failed brothers, incorporated their biological matter into his own enhanced form, though the nutrients came disguised as injection solutions and hypnochemical treatments. The chapter's dirty secret went deeper than mere resource management. In Vault Septimus, behind doors that required both his genetic signature and the authorization of 3 other senior apothecaries, lay the true horror of their survival. Here were the living failures, aspirants whose transformations had gone wrong in ways that defied easy classification, whose bodies had accepted some implants while grotesquely mutating others. They were kept alive because their twisted physiologies sometimes produced unique biological compounds, enzymes that couldn't be synthesized any other way, antibodies that formed only in their perpetual agony. Mordekai checked the status readings on Containment Unit 3, where something that had once been named Theron floated in suspension fluid. Half space marine, half cancerous mass, the thing's body produced a unique protein chain essential for stabilizing gene seed in long-term storage. It had been here for 60 years, aware but unable to die, its nervous system rewired to interpret all sensation as pain to maximize the stress hormones that catalyzed the protein production. Blessed is the sacrifice that serves, Mordekai murmured, the ritual words tasting like ash. He'd spoken them over thousands of failures, watched the light fade from young eyes, harvested organs while hearts still beat because the tissue degraded too quickly after death. The chapter's chaplains preached about honor and duty, about the nobility of those chosen to attempt ascension, but they'd never stood in these chambers at 3 in the morning, listening to the wetwork servitors systematically dismantling a child who dreamed of becoming an angel. They'd never had to make the choice Mordekai faced daily: maintain the chapter's fighting strength through atrocity, or watch it slowly wither as gene seed stocks depleted and no new brothers could be made. The vox bead in his ear crackled with an encrypted transmission from the surface. Another batch of aspirants had been collected from the neighboring systems, 300 boys between the ages of 8 and 14, already en route to the fortress monastery. By conservative estimates, perhaps 5 would survive full implantation. The rest would end up here, their biological legacy incorporated into future generations, their names forgotten except in the sealed data crypts that track genetic markers and rejection patterns. Mordekai began preparing the extraction chambers for the next harvest, instructing the servitors to clean the bone saws and sharpen the flaying mechadendrites. In 40 hours, these chambers would fill with screams again, with the wet sounds of separation, with the mechanical hymns the servitors sang as they worked, binary prayers that thanked each failure for their contribution to the chapter's survival. The truth that no Imperial citizen could ever know was that space marines weren't created. They were built from the corpses of children who dared to dream of transcendence. Every chapter in the Imperium maintained facilities like this, hidden beneath their noble facades, staffed by apothecaries who'd learned to see human bodies as collections of useful components rather than failed heroes. The flesh tithe was eternal, demanding payment in blood and bone and broken dreams, feeding the engines of transformation that kept humanity's defenders operational. As Mordekai sealed the vault and began his long ascent back to the monastery proper, he wondered if the Emperor had foreseen this necessity when he'd created the first space marines, if he'd known that angels could only be born from an abattoir's efficiency. The thought was borderline heretical, but down here, surrounded by the remnants of 10,000 failures, heresy and truth became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Tomorrow, he would stand in the Great Hall as successful aspirants received their black carapace implants, would speak the traditional words of welcome, would tell them they'd earned their place through strength and will alone. He would not tell them about their brothers who hadn't made it, whose dissolved flesh now flowed through their veins, whose processed organs had been used to practice the very procedures that had saved them. That knowledge was the burden of the apothecarian alone, to know that every Space Marine's glory was built on a foundation of efficiently managed atrocity. Brother Librarian Kallos stood before the sealed door of Indoctrination Chamber 7, feeling the psychic screams bleeding through 3 feet of psychically warded adamantium. Inside, neophyte Dantius was experiencing his 43rd hour of memory restructuring, that delicate process where human recollections were burned away to make room for tactical doctrines and chapter mythology. The screaming wasn't physical. Dantius's body lay perfectly still on the surgical throne, neural shunts piercing his skull at 17 different points. His eyes rolled back to show only whites. The screaming came from deeper, from the parts of his mind that recognized they were being murdered, neuron by neuron, synapse by synapse. Kallos had undergone the same process 2 centuries ago, though he remembered almost nothing of his life before. Just fragments that surfaced in dreams, a woman's laugh, the taste of bread, the feeling of rain on skin that hadn't yet been covered in ceramite and scar tissue. The hypno-indoctrination machines hummed with malevolent purpose, their cogitator banks containing 10,000 years of warfare doctrine that needed to be carved into Dantius's brain. But first, space had to be made. The process was like burning a library to make room for a weapons depot. Everything that had made Dantius human was being systematically deleted. His mother's face would go first, then his siblings if he had any, then the memories of play and laughter and fear that had shaped his personality. The chaplains called it purification, but Kallos had seen the archived brain scans, had studied what really happened in these chambers. It wasn't replacement, it was overlay, with the human memories compressed but not truly destroyed, pushed down into the subcortical regions where they festered like psychic wounds. Every Space Marine carried within their skull a ghost of who they'd been, screaming eternally beneath layers of conditioning and hypnotic blocks. The door's lock disengaged with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, and Kallos entered to find Chief Apothecary Severan adjusting the neural probe configurations. His resistance index is higher than optimal, Severan noted, his voice betraying no emotion about the teenager writhing in invisible agony before them. We've had to increase the synaptic burn rate by 30%. There's a risk of cascade failure if we push harder. Kallos extended his psychic senses, feeling the shape of Dantius's disintegrating personality, like watching a sculpture being attacked with hammers. The boy had been strong-willed, intelligent, curious, all qualities that made for excellent Space Marines but also made the conditioning process exponentially more difficult. The strong-willed ones fought hardest against their own destruction, their minds refusing to accept the cognitive murder being performed upon them. Continue at current levels, Kallos ordered, though he could feel Dantius's essential self beginning to fragment. Better a servitor than a failed Marine. It was a lie they all told themselves. The truth was that failed conditioning created something far worse than servitors. In the restricted section of the Librarium, Kallos maintained records of every battlebrother whose conditioning had catastrophically failed over the past 3 millennia. Brother Garen, who'd recovered his childhood memories during a battlefield trauma and had spent 3 days skinning civilians while crying and calling them by his siblings' names. Brother Torment, whose personality had split into 7 distinct fragments, each one claiming to be the real Marine, leading to him executing his entire squad in confused paranoia. Brother Cyrus, who'd begun aging rapidly when his hypno-conditioning collapsed, his body remembering mortality, aging 50 years and 5 days before his hearts finally stopped. These were the chapter's most guarded secrets, worse than any gene seed deviation or mutation. At least twisted flesh could be purged with fire, but corrupted memories spread like viruses through a company. Kallos had personally hunted 3 battle brothers in the past decade whose conditioning had begun unraveling, tracking them through the fortress monastery's depths as they experienced cascading personality collapse. The worst had been Brother Matthias, a century-old veteran who'd suddenly remembered his daughter, a daughter he'd had at 13, before recruitment, whose existence had been surgically excised from his memories. The recovered memory had shattered his entire psycho-indoctrinated worldview, and he'd spent 6 days carving her name into his own flesh with a combat knife, whispering apologies to a child who'd been dead for 100 years. When Kallos had finally cornered him, Matthias had begged for death in a voice that sounded nothing like a space marine. It had been the voice of a father, broken and human and absolutely forbidden. The Librarium's secret archive contained thousands of similar cases, each one meticulously documented to identify patterns in conditioning failure. Certain genetic markers predisposed some aspirants to memory resurrection. Extreme trauma could crack hypnotic barriers. Exposure to specific psyker abilities could unravel years of indoctrination in seconds. Most terrifying were the spontaneous failures. Brothers who simply woke up one day with their human memories intact, suddenly aware that they'd been transformed into weapons through systematic psychological brutalization. These brothers rarely lasted more than a few hours before either taking their own lives or needing to be terminated, their recovered humanity incompatible with what they'd become. Kallos watched as Severan inserted another neural probe into Dantius's temporal lobe, targeting a cluster of memories related to familial bonding. The boy's body convulsed despite the paralytic agents, tears streaming from his unseeing eyes. His lacrimal response indicates deep memory trauma, Severan observed clinically. We're approaching the core personality engrams. This was the most critical phase, where the fundamental sense of self was restructured. Too aggressive, and they'd create a hollow automaton incapable of tactical innovation. Too gentle, and the human personality would survive, hidden beneath the conditioning, waiting for any weakness to reassert itself. The balance was so precise that even with 10 millennia of refinement, the failure rate remained 30%. 30% who emerged from indoctrination as either vegetables or time bombs of psychological instability. The monitoring cogitators began displaying warning runes as Dantius's brain activity spiked beyond acceptable parameters. Inside his mind, Kallos could feel the boy's last purely human thought, a memory of making bread with his grandmother, the warmth of the oven, the yeast smell, her weathered hands guiding his smaller ones. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and it was being burned away with surgical precision, replaced with attack patterns and weapon specifications. Memory cluster neutralized, Severan announced. Initiating combat doctrine implantation. The machines began force-feeding Dantius's scorched neurons with battle knowledge, each tactical scenario writing itself over the deleted human experiences. Where once the boy had known how to braid his sister's hair, he would now know 17 ways to kill with his bare hands. Where once he'd remembered his favorite song, he would now carry the technical specifications of every bolter pattern used by the chapter. But Kallos knew the truth that even Severan might not fully grasp. The memories never truly died. They were compressed, encrypted, buried beneath mountains of conditioning, but they remained like seeds in frozen soil. Every space marine was a walking battlefield between what they'd been forced to become and what they'd been born as, with the Librarians serving as guardians against the constant threat of remembrance. In the deepest vaults of the Librarium, Kallos maintained the Omega Archive, containing the recovered memories extracted from failed Marines before their termination. Thousands of human lives, compressed into data crystals, the last evidence that the Emperor's angels had once been children with mothers and dreams and fears. Sometimes, in the fortress monastery's quietest hours, Kallos would access these archives and experience secondhand what had been stolen from him. The sensation of unaugmented human emotion, of love without purpose, of fear without shame, of joy without tactical application. Brother Captain Azrael of the Blood Angels successor chapter, known as the Flesh Tearers, could taste the difference between fear sweat and pain sweat at 30 paces, even through his helm's respirator filters. The Xenos prisoner chained to the sanctum wall was producing both in quantities that made his gene-enhanced salivary glands flood his mouth with anticipation. He'd been standing here for 17 minutes, hands clenched so tight that his gauntlets ceramite groaned, fighting the urge that sang through his bloodstream like a hymn composed in violence and hunger. The chaplains called it the red thirst, spoke of it as a flaw to be overcome through prayer and discipline, but standing here in the feeding chamber that officially didn't exist, Azrael knew the truth. It wasn't a flaw to overcome but an appetite to be carefully managed, like rationing ammunition or monitoring Prometheum reserves. The chamber existed in the fortress monastery's architectural blind spots, accessible only through passages that appeared on no official schematics. Every flesh-tearer knew it was here, though none spoke of it above a whisper, and never where the serfs might overhear. The walls were bare adamantium, scorched clean after each use with promethium and industrial solvents, though the scent of old blood had soaked too deep into the metal to ever truly disappear. Chains hung from the ceiling at precise intervals, their restraints sized for everything from human to orc, each set bearing the scratches and dents of 10,000 previous occupants. In the corner sat a cogitator that recorded nothing, monitored by servitors whose short-term memory cores were wiped every 6 hours. What happened here stayed here, buried beneath layers of necessity and shame. The Xenos, a Tau fire warrior captured during the Daleth compliance, had stopped struggling an hour ago. Once it understood that the chains were molecular bonded and that screaming only brought the angel figure closer. Azrael could see his own reflection in the creature's wide eyes, could read the realization spreading across its flat face that humanity's defenders were something far worse than simple soldiers. The chapter's sanguinary priests had explained the biological mechanisms behind the thirst, how the genetic flaw in their Primarch's legacy created an addiction to hemoglobin consumption, how their enhanced bodies craved the iron-rich sustenance in ways that transcended mere hunger. But explanations didn't capture what it felt like to stand here, every nerve screaming for release, knowing that the only thing preventing him from tearing into living flesh was willpower stretched so thin it had become transparent. "Control defines us." Chaplain Mordekai's voice came from the chamber's entrance, his skull-faced helm somehow making the words more ominous. "But control has limits, brother captain. You've been combat active for 43 consecutive days. Your neurochemical balance has shifted beyond acceptable parameters." Mordekai moved to the control panel and checked the prisoner's vital signs with practiced efficiency. This one's cardiovascular system can sustain extraction for approximately 20 minutes before catastrophic failure. Make it last. The chaplain's matter-of-fact tone made the horror worse. This wasn't aberration or chaos corruption. This was chapter protocol, sanctioned by the highest levels of command, a necessary evil carved into their very existence. Azrael removed his gauntlets with deliberate slowness, revealing hands that hadn't been entirely human in 2 centuries. His fingers ended in hardened keratin that could punch through plasteel, nails that had been filed down 1,000 times but always grew back sharp. The thirst wasn't just about blood, it was about the act of taking it, the primal regression to something that predated civilization, that lived in the reptilian core of their augmented brains. He approached the Tau with footsteps that echoed like execution drums, watching the prisoner's pulse accelerate in the visible vein along its neck. 20 minutes, Mordekai had said. Azrael knew he could make it last 10 at most before the hunger overrode everything else, before he stopped being a space marine and became something closer to the monsters they were meant to destroy. The first cut was always the hardest because it required admitting what he was about to do, acknowledging that all the hypno-indoctrination and loyalty conditioning in the Imperium couldn't suppress 10,000 years of genetic corruption. His sharpened thumbnail opened the Tau's shoulder with surgical precision, and the scent of alien blood hit his enhanced olfactory receptors like a weapon discharge. It was wrong-tasting, chemically different from human blood, but his body didn't care. The thirst recognized only iron and protein and the specific enzymes that his corrupted gene seed craved. He pressed his mouth to the wound and drank, feeling the hot liquid slide down his throat, feeling his body respond with a cascade of neurochemical rewards that made combat drugs seem pedestrian by comparison. The Tau made sounds that might have been words in its own language, or perhaps just the universal vocabulary of suffering. Azrael forced himself to drink slowly, to take measured quantities, to remain aware enough that this was feeding rather than frenzy. Other brothers had lost themselves in this moment, had torn their subjects apart in ecstatic violence, had emerged from the feeding chambers covered in viscera and shame, unable to look their brothers in the eye for weeks afterward. The chapter maintained a careful balance, deprived the afflicted too long and they became liabilities in combat, prone to attacking anything that bled. Feed them too frequently and they developed dependencies that made them little better than the blood-sucking Xenos that haunted death worlds across the Imperium. Mordekai monitored the proceedings with the detachment of a tech marine observing a machine calibration. He'd overseen thousands of these feedings, had personally executed 3 brothers who'd crossed the line from managed affliction to uncontrollable addiction. The chaplain maintained extensive records on every flesh-tearer's feeding schedule, tracking patterns and deviations, predicting when brothers would need access to the chambers before they themselves realized the hunger had become critical. It was brutal logistics applied to darker purposes, ensuring the chapter remained combat effective while managing a genetic flaw that should have seen them declared excommunicate traitores centuries ago. The only reason they survived was usefulness. Flesh tearers in the grip of controlled thirst were among the most terrifying close combat specialists in the entire Adeptus Astartes, worth the moral compromise of keeping them supplied with subjects. The prisoner's struggles weakened as blood loss began shutting down its peripheral systems. Azrael pulled back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, the gesture so human and so monstrous simultaneously that it made him want to laugh or scream or both. His gene-enhanced body was already processing the consumed blood, breaking it down into the specific compounds his corrupted system required, flooding his brain with satisfaction signals that made the eternal war seem almost bearable. This was the secret at the heart of his chapter. They weren't just warriors, they were addicts, their entire existence structured around managing cravings that would horrify the imperial citizens they protected. Every glorious battle, every heroic last stand, every tale of the flesh-tearer's ferocity was built on a foundation of feeding chambers and carefully rationed prisoners and chaplains who'd learned to calculate blood volume with terrifying precision. Enough! Mordekai's command cut through the neurochemical haze, and Azrael stepped back immediately, the conditioning asserting itself even through the thirst satisfaction. The Tau slumped in its chains, still breathing but barely, its blue-gray skin now pallid and slick with shock sweat. A serf would arrive within minutes to remove it. The survivors were usually transported to penal colonies with fabricated memories of their capture, never knowing they'd served a purpose far darker than simple interrogation. The dead were processed through the fortress monastery's plasma incinerators, their ashes scattered into the void where no evidence could ever surface. The Inquisition suspected, of course. They always suspected. But the flesh-tearer's combat record spoke loudly enough that uncomfortable questions remained unasked, buried under mountains of commendations and battle honors. But the flesh-tearers were far from alone in their darkness. Azrael had met brothers from other chapters during joint operations, had recognized the signs in their eyes, the careful way they avoided certain topics. The space wolves and their careful management of the Wolfen curse. The hidden kennels where brothers who'd regressed too far were kept chained and feral, brought out only for the most desperate battles. The black dragons and their bone blade mutations, the way their apothecaries harvested the calcium growths from their bodies, studying the deviations that should have marked them as excommunicate. The sons of Antaeus and whatever genetic modifications gave them their legendary resilience, modifications that required regular infusions of compounds extracted from living subjects in ways that made even the flesh-tearer's feeding chambers seem merciful. Every chapter harbored its hunger, its genetic flaw that demanded feeding. Some craved blood, others violence, still others substances that couldn't be named in polite imperial discourse. The Administratum maintained a classified archive on Ganymede's third moon, accessible only to the highest echelons of the Adeptus Terra, documenting every known deviation and the protocols for managing them. Azrael had seen fragments of it once, recovered from a slain Inquisitor's databanks during the Carthago incident. The list had been staggering, dozens of chapters, each with their own darkness, each with their own feeding chambers and secret protocols and carefully managed atrocities. The file on the flesh-tearers alone had run to 3,000 pages, detailing 2 centuries of feeding schedules, prisoner acquisitions, and incident reports from times when brothers had lost control in civilian populations. The truly horrifying revelation had been the supply chain. Certain rogue traders held contracts to provide suitable subjects, prisoners, xenos, condemned criminals, delivered to chapter fleets with the same bureaucratic efficiency as ammunition shipments. Specific forge worlds manufactured the specialized equipment for the feeding chambers, though the work orders were always disguised as medical apparatus or interrogation tools. The Departamento Munitorum allocated resources for enhanced interrogation protocols that everyone involved knew meant something far darker. The entire edifice of the Imperium was complicit, supporting the hunger cults through carefully structured ignorance and plausible deniability. Azrael sealed his gauntlets back on, the action helping him rebuild the mental walls between what he'd just done and what he needed to be. Outside this chamber, he was Brother Captain Azrael, leader of the 3rd Company, bearer of 17 campaign honors, veteran of 400 battles. Inside this chamber, he was an addict getting his fix, no different from the underhive narcotic users he'd executed for weakness during compliance actions. The cognitive dissonance was part of the burden, part of the price of being what the Imperium needed. As he left the feeding chamber, passing Mordekai at the threshold, the chaplain's final words followed him like a benediction and a curse. The Emperor protects, brother, even from the truth of what we've become. The door sealed behind him with the finality of a tomb closing, and Azrael ascended back toward the fortress monastery's upper levels, where the light was cleaner and the lies were easier to maintain. Chapter Master Hadrian of the Storm Wardens stood in a chamber that existed in no official records, surrounded by 9 other chapter masters whose names would be redacted from this account even if it were ever discovered. The hololithic projection between them showed the Golden Throne in 3 dimensions, its mechanisms rendered in painful detail by sources that no one present would acknowledge. The image flickered and rotated slowly, and every master in the room could see what the Adeptus Custodes had been hiding for millennia. The hairline fractures spreading through the webway portal seals, the fluctuating power readings from the psychic amplifiers, the microdegradation that accumulated in systems never meant to function for 10,000 uninterrupted years. Brother Chaplain Erasmus of the Mentors had compiled this data over 3 centuries, trading favors and secrets with rogue traders and corrupted Mechanicum adepts, assembling a picture that the High Lords of Terra would execute entire worlds to suppress. The Astronomican's luminosity has decreased by 0.03% in the past decade, Erasmus stated, his voice carrying none of the fervor expected from his office. Statistically insignificant across shorter periods, but the trend line is unmistakable when projected across millennia. At current rates of degradation, critical failure occurs within 7 to 12,000 years. However, cascade scenarios could accelerate that timeline dramatically. He manipulated the hololithic controls, and the throne's image was replaced by stellar cartography showing the Imperium fractured into isolated segments, each one slowly going dark as the warp made travel impossible. Without the Astronomican, we return to the old night. Every chapter becomes an isolated kingdom, every forge world a separate empire. Humanity fragments into 10 million pieces, each one prey to Xenos and worse. Chapter Master Valtar of the Black Templars slammed his fist on the table, the impact cracking the ancient wood. This is heresy. The God Emperor is eternal. This council itself is treasonous. But he hadn't left in the 3 previous gatherings over the past century, because even the most faithful could see the cracks forming. The Black Templars' eternal crusade had taken them to the Imperium's furthest reaches, and Valtar had witnessed firsthand how the Astronomican's light had grown dimmer in certain sectors, how navigators reported increasing difficulty maintaining warp routes that had been stable for millennia. Faith couldn't seal warp rifts or repair archaeotech that predated human civilization. Faith couldn't stop entropy. We speak not of if, but when, Hadrian said quietly, and the room fell silent. And we speak not of preventing, but of surviving. Every chapter master in this room commands between 1 and 10,000 Adeptus Astartes. We hold fortress monasteries, fleet assets, gene seed stocks, and weapons that could crack worlds. When the throne fails, when the Imperium shatters, our chapters may be all that remains of human civilization in our respective sectors. The question before us is simple. Do we plan for that inevitability? Or do we pretend it cannot happen and doom our successors to extinction? The silence that followed was answer enough. These were not traitors, not in their own minds. They were pragmatists facing an impossible future, warriors trained to plan for every contingency, discovering that the greatest threat was the one they'd been conditioned never to acknowledge. In the shadows beyond the hololithic light, servitors stood with their recording systems disabled, their memory cores set to wipe every 6 hours. No record of this gathering would survive beyond the minds of those present. If the Inquisition discovered even rumors of these meetings, every chapter represented here would face exterminatus. But that risk paled compared to the certainty of what was coming. Chapter Master Kalin of the Red Scorpions activated a data slate, its contents protected by encryption that would fry the device if tampered with. My tech marines have been reverse engineering Xenotech for 2 centuries. Tau gravitational systems, Eldar energy matrices, even fragments of Necron technology recovered from tomb worlds. All carefully hidden from the Mechanicum's prying sensors. He looked around the table, meeting each master's gaze. We tell ourselves it's to understand our enemies, to gain tactical advantages. But the truth is simpler. When the forges of Mars go dark, when we can no longer receive supplies through established channels, these technologies may be all that keeps our chapter operational. I have 3 tech marines who could be executed for technoheresy tomorrow. I keep them alive because I know they may be the only reason my chapter survives the next age. Master Sethrak of the Exorcists leaned forward, his face half-shadowed. My librarians have been conducting experiments that would see us declared excommunicate if discovered. We've been testing the limits of psychic communion, attempting to create a localized beacon that could guide ships through the warp without the Astronomicon. The process requires sacrifices. Psychers burned out as living waypoints, their souls consumed to create momentary guideposts through the Imperium. We've lost 47 subjects so far. 12 have produced results that lasted more than 3 hours. His voice carried no pride, only grim calculation. If the Astronomicon fails, this chapter will not go quietly into isolation. We will maintain contact with our successor chapters, will preserve what fragments of the Imperium we can reach. Whatever the cost. The costs were already mounting, Hadrian knew. Every chapter present had begun hoarding resources in ways that technically violated their oaths to the Imperium. Gene seed banks were being expanded beyond authorized limits, with excess stocks hidden in secret vaults. Fleet elements were being held back from campaigns, kept in reserve for contingencies that couldn't be officially named. Fortress monasteries were being fortified not just against external threats but configured as self-sustaining arcologies that could survive centuries of isolation. Entire planets were being quietly brought under chapter control through mechanisms the Administratum didn't recognize, creating hidden empires within the Imperium's official borders. Some chapters had gone further into darkness. Master Tybalt of the Carcardon spoke of deep void caches established at the galaxy's edges, supply depots stocked with everything from gene seed to Titan-class weapons, hidden in regions so remote that even the Imperium's fall wouldn't affect them. The Carcharadans had been preparing for isolation since their founding, their entire culture built around self-sufficiency and survival in the void between stars. We have learned to take what we need from those we conquer, Tybalt said, his voice carrying the accent of old Terran oceanic cultures. Gene seed from the fallen, technology from the defeated, recruits from populations that have no choice but to serve. When the Imperium ends, we will endure because we have already learned to exist outside its support systems. Chapter Master Asterion of the Minotaurs remained silent, but Hadrian knew his chapter's secret. They'd maintained contact with the High Lords of Terra at levels that suggested direct patronage, possibly even from the custodes themselves. The Minotaurs received equipment and support far beyond what their nominal status should provide, and their deployment patterns suggested they served purposes that the broader Imperium never saw. If contingency planning was happening at the highest levels, the Minotaurs were likely already implementing it, their entire chapter possibly positioned as a failsafe for when the throne's collapse became imminent. That they attended these meetings at all suggested that even Terra's chosen guardians recognized that official plans might not be enough. "We're building kingdoms," Master Hadrian said finally, giving voice to the unspoken truth. Each of us, in our own way, is preparing for a future where we are not servants of the Imperium but its successors. We are becoming the warlords and god-kings that will rule over the fragments when the whole shatters. The question is whether we can live with that necessity, or whether the guilt will destroy us before the throne does. No one answered, because there was no answer that wouldn't sound like treason or delusion. They were locked into their course by the simple mathematics of survival, by the recognition that loyalty to a dead Imperium was less important than preserving what humanity remained. The theological implications were perhaps worse than the practical ones. Chaplain Mordant of the Black Dragons had brought a report from his order's hidden conclaves, and his words had shaken even the most pragmatic masters present. "We have been rewriting the Imperial Creed," he'd admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "creating variations that can function without a living emperor, liturgies that transform his death into apotheosis rather than defeat. We're preparing our brothers for the possibility that the God-Emperor might transcend physical form entirely, that his death on the throne could be rebirth into pure divinity." The heresy in those words was staggering, but it was also necessary. If the Emperor died and the chapters maintained that he still watched over them from some higher plane, that faith might preserve order when everything else collapsed. If they admitted he was simply gone, that humanity's God had failed, the psychological devastation could destroy the Adeptus Astartes from within. Some chapters had taken even darker paths. Master Hadrian had heard rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of chapters experimenting with methods to preserve their gene seed's psychic connection to their primarchs, attempting to create closed genetic loops that didn't require the Emperor's distant blessing. Others whispered of chapters making pacts with entities they refused to name, seeking powers that could sustain them when the Astronomican's light finally guttered out. The line between pragmatic preparation and outright chaos corruption was growing dangerously thin, and every master in this room knew that some of their brothers had likely already crossed it. But what alternative existed? Watch their chapters slowly die as resources dwindled and isolation became absolute? Or compromise their principles in exchange for survival, becoming the very things they'd sworn to destroy? "We need to discuss succession," Master Vorin of the Marines Errant said, changing the subject to something even more uncomfortable. "When the Imperium falls, we become the legitimate authority in our regions. But by what right? We were created to serve, not to rule. Our chapters will need new founding mythologies, new sources of legitimacy that don't depend on Terra's authority." He was right, Hadrian realized. The Adeptus Astartes had always been weapons in someone else's hands, pointed at threats by the High Lords and the Emperor himself. In the post-imperial age, they would need to justify their power through new narratives, perhaps as the Emperor's appointed successors, perhaps as the last bastions of civilization, perhaps as something else entirely. The chapters that survived would be those who could make the transition from servant to sovereign without losing the discipline that made them effective. The hololithic display shifted again, now showing demographic projections and resource distribution models. Chapter worlds would need to become self-sustaining empires, their populations carefully managed to provide recruits, servitors, and all the supporting infrastructure that a Space Marine chapter required. Some masters had already begun implementing population control measures on their recruiting worlds, selectively breeding for genetic compatibility, establishing bloodlines that would produce higher quality aspirants. It was eugenics on a planetary scale, the kind of program that would have appalled the Imperium's official doctrine even as it aligned perfectly with the Adeptus Astartes' practical requirements. When the Imperium fell and the pretense of serving humanity could be dropped, these breeding programs would intensify. Humanity would survive, but under the absolute control of its armored angels, reduced to resources for their master's continuation. 3 more chapters have requested entry to these councils, Erasmus reported. The Mantis Warriors, the Raptors, and the Sons of Medusa. Each has demonstrated awareness of the throne's degradation and has begun independent preparation. Do we expand our numbers, or maintain operational security through limitation? The question hung in the air, weighted with implications. Every additional chapter brought more resources and knowledge but also increased the risk of discovery. And not every chapter could be trusted with this knowledge. Some were too fanatical, too bound to the imperial creed to accept the necessity of preparation. Others might use the information to accelerate the collapse, believing they could seize power in the chaos. This council required very specific kinds of chapter masters, those pragmatic enough to face reality but disciplined enough not to become the very threat they were preparing to survive. Hadrian made the decision that he knew the others expected. We expand carefully. Each new chapter is vetted through 3 existing members. We share only what they need to know, compartmentalize the deeper preparations. If the Inquisition discovers us, we must be able to sacrifice individual chapters without exposing the whole network. It was cold logic, the same tactical thinking that guided battlefield decisions, now applied to treason and survival in equal measure. He looked around the table at warriors who'd dedicated centuries to the Imperium's service, now planning for its end with the same methodical precision they'd once used to plan its defense. The meeting concluded with the same ritual that had ended the previous gatherings, each chapter master placing his hand on the hololithic projector, swearing an oath that would never be recorded, pledging to preserve humanity's future even if it meant destroying humanity's present. They were already ghosts, Hadrian thought, existing in the space between loyal servant and independent warlord, waiting for the moment when the transformation became complete. When they departed, it would be separately, their fleet elements leaving the rendezvous point at staggered intervals, returning to their domains to continue preparations that grew darker with each passing year. Alone in his transport back to the Storm Warden's Fortress Monastery, Hadrian accessed the encrypted files that detailed his chapter's own contingencies. Weapons that violated the Treaty of Mars. Psychic research that bordered on sorcery. Genetic experiments that treated human populations as livestock for selective improvement. Each plan was a small treason, but together they formed a comprehensive blueprint for survival in a post-imperial galaxy. He thought about the Emperor, somewhere on Terra, slowly dying on a throne that failed by microscopic degrees each day. Did he know what his angels were planning? Did he approve, seeing it as necessary pragmatism? Or would he weep to know that his greatest warriors were preparing to become the very tyrants he'd fought to overthrow during the Unification Wars? The questions had no answers, only the cold certainty that when the Astronomican's light finally died, the Adeptus Astartes would endure, and humanity would survive beneath their armored boots, whether it wished to or not. Brother Sergeant Tychon of the Celestial Lions had found the vault during the Fortress Monastery's reconstruction after the Orc siege of Elysium 7. It shouldn't have existed according to the architectural plans, but there it was, a chamber precisely 3 meters square, sealed behind walls that registered as solid stone to every auspex scan yet opened when he'd placed his palm against a specific section of masonry. Inside, mounted on a plinth of black marble veined with gold, sat a crystalline data core unlike anything in the chapter's recorded archives. The outer casing bore the seal of the Adeptus Custodes and a date stamp from the chapter's founding 8 millennia ago. No dust covered its surface despite the vault's apparent age. No corrosion marked the precious metals. It had been waiting here for someone to find it, or perhaps waiting for something else entirely. A signal, a command, a specific set of conditions that would activate whatever purpose lay encrypted in its crystalline matrices. Tychon had brought the core to Chapter Master Ikeen in secret, some instinct warning him that this discovery fell outside normal channels of command. The Master had stared at it for 17 minutes in complete silence before ordering the Librarium sealed and the Fortress Monastery's Geller field generators brought to full power. Only then, isolated from the warp and all external communication, had he activated the core. What they'd witnessed in the hololithic projection had redefined Tychon's understanding of what the Celestial Lions truly were. Not an independent chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, not warriors serving at the Imperium's pleasure, but a weapon with a safety mechanism, a controlled burn that could be extinguished the moment it threatened to spread beyond designated parameters. The protocols were called the Terminus Decree, though each chapter's version had different names, different activation conditions, different methodologies for the same ultimate purpose. Complete and total self-termination of the chapter should specific criteria be met. The hololithic display had shown genetic kill switches woven into their gene seed at the molecular level, viral agents stored in sealed vaults throughout the Fortress Monastery that could be released to render every Celestial Lion's enhanced physiology lethally toxic within hours. Fail-safes built into their armor's power systems that could overload every reactor simultaneously. Psychic triggers embedded in the Librarius that could be activated by certain code phrases, turning the chapter's psychers into living bombs that would immolate the Fortress Monastery and everyone within it. Navigation hazard beacons hidden in the fleet's capital ships, broadcasting signals that would draw every hostile force within 3 sectors directly to the chapter's location. The activation conditions were disturbingly broad. Genetic deviation beyond specified parameters. Evidence of chaos taint among the chapter's leadership. Refusal to comply with direct orders from the High Lords of Terra. Sustained combat operations against Imperial forces. Extended periods without contact with the Administratum. The criteria were structured such that any chapter could theoretically be marked for termination at any moment, the decision requiring only the agreement of 3 High Lords and the authentication of a custodian. No trial, no investigation, no appeal. Just activation of protocols that would transform an entire chapter from defenders of humanity into self-destructing failsafes, their fortress monasteries becoming their tombs, their gene seed rendered into biological poison that would ensure no successor could ever rise from their ashes. Every chapter has this, Ikeen had said, his voice hollow with realization. Every fortress monastery, every founding, every gene line. We are all weapons with dead man switches, tolerated only so long as we remain useful and controllable. He'd accessed historical records then, cross-referencing them with the Terminus Decree specifications, and the pattern had emerged like a disease diagnosis. The Celestial Lion's near annihilation during the Third War for Armageddon, when an Inquisitor's forces had accidentally targeted them with orbital fire, had that truly been an accident? Or had it been a failed activation of their Terminus protocol? Damage intended to cripple the chapter after they'd questioned the Inquisition's methods too publicly? The Firehawk's disappearance into the warp, the Flame Falcon's sudden declaration of excommunicate traitores, the Soul Drinker's genetic corruption that had emerged so conveniently after they'd begun operating independently. How many chapter destructions throughout history had been organic failures versus deliberate activations of hidden protocols? Tychon had spent the following months conducting his own investigation, traveling under pretense of diplomatic missions to 3 other chapters with whom the Celestial Lions maintained close relations. In each fortress monastery, he'd found ways to probe carefully, asking questions that seemed innocent but were structured to reveal awareness. The Master of Sanctity from the Marines Errant had responded with a knowing look and taken him to a chamber identical to the one Tychon had discovered. The Chief Librarian of the Howling Griffins had shown him genetic analysis proving their catalepsian node implants contained dormant kill code sequences. The Reclusiarch of the Aurora chapter had displayed archived Vox recordings of custodian guard visiting their fortress monastery every century, performing compliance verification that involved deep scans of their gene seed repositories and armory vaults. Every chapter knew, or at least their highest leadership did. Every chapter lived with the knowledge that their existence was conditional, that they served at the pleasure of powers who viewed them not as heroes but as barely controlled weapons that might need to be destroyed at any moment. The truly disturbing discovery had come when Tychon accessed the Celestial Lion's oldest battle records, documents preserved from their founding era that had survived 8,000 years of war and loss. Among the routine supply manifests and deployment orders, he'd found references to system terminus maintenance schedules, to specialists from Terra who arrived unannounced to perform foundational security protocols, to chapter brothers who'd been reassigned to eternal vault duty and subsequently vanished from all records. The terminus protocols weren't added after a chapter's creation. They were woven into the very fabric of chapter founding, built into the fortress monastery's construction, implanted into the first generation of gene seed. Every Space Marine chapter was born with its own suicide mechanism already installed, ticking quietly in the background, waiting for activation codes that could come at any moment. Some chapters had attempted to disable their protocols. The data core contained encrypted records of these attempts, cataloged with clinical precision. The Astral Claws had discovered their terminus systems during the Badab War and had frantically tried to purge them, one of many factors that had contributed to their desperation and eventual fall to chaos. The Sons of Malice had successfully removed certain genetic kill switches, only to discover that doing so had broken their gene seed stability, leading to mutations that eventually saw them excommunicated. The Relictors had tried to replace their tainted protocols with Xenotech alternatives and had been declared traitores when the substitution was discovered. Every attempt at liberation had ended in destruction, as though the terminus protocols were designed with safeguards against their own removal, as though the very act of trying to escape marked a chapter as irredeemably compromised. Chapter Master Keen had made a decision that Tychon both admired and feared. Rather than attempt removal, the Celestial Lions would document everything, create multiple encrypted copies, and distribute them to trusted brothers throughout the chapter and to allied chapters. If they were destroyed, the knowledge would survive. If the terminus protocols were activated, at least some record would exist of why they'd truly fallen. It was a small act of defiance, but also an acceptance that they were trapped, that escape was impossible, that the best they could hope for was to die with their eyes open rather than in ignorance. Tychon had personally overseen the distribution, creating a network of knowledge that violated every principle of operational security, but ensured that the truth couldn't be completely suppressed. The hardest part had been telling the other brothers. Not everyone. Some warriors were too fanatical, too devoted to the Imperium's mythology to handle the revelation that they were expendable assets with built-in expiration dates. But the senior leadership, the veteran sergeants, the librarians and chaplains who'd earned the right to uncomfortable truths, they needed to know. Tychon had watched faith die in good men's eyes as they understood what they truly were, had seen the moment when absolute loyalty transformed into something more complex and painful, the recognition that they would continue serving, continue fighting, continue dying for an Imperium that viewed them as temporarily useful resources rather than its greatest heroes. Brother Librarian Zuberi had taken the revelation hardest. He'd served the chapter for 3 centuries, had touched the Emperor's light through the warp, had felt what he'd believed was divine approval for his psychic gifts. Learning that those same gifts contained hidden switches, that a coded transmission could turn his mind into a weapon against his own brothers, had broken something fundamental in his worldview. For 6 weeks, he'd isolated himself in the Librarium's deepest meditation chamber, wrestling with the theological implications. When he'd emerged, his eyes had carried a new hardness, a quality that Tychon recognized from the mirror. The look of someone who'd stopped believing in benevolent oversight and started believing only in survival. The custodian guard visits more chapters than we realized, Zuberi had reported after completing his psychic research. Every generation, sometimes more frequently. They're not inspections, they're system verification checks, ensuring the terminus protocols remain functional and uncompromised. I've touched the minds of brothers who've encountered them, seen the memories they tried to bury. The custodians carry activation keys, physical objects that interface with the fortress monastery's core systems. In the event of emergency, a single custodian could trigger a chapter's complete destruction from within its own walls. The image was chilling. The Emperor's golden guardians, revered as the pinnacle of human enhancement, revealed as executioners maintaining deadman switches on 10,000 chapters across the galaxy. Some chapters had turned their knowledge into preparation. If the terminus protocols were inevitable, they would at least control the timing. Chapter Master Keen had learned of the Lamenter's contingency, a carefully crafted plan to transfer their gene seed to hidden repositories before their predicted destruction. The Mantis warriors maintained secret successor forces, unofficial companies hidden on distant worlds, prepared to continue the chapter's legacy if the main body was terminated. The exorcists had allegedly found ways to shield portions of their fortress monastery from certain protocol activations, creating safe rooms that could survive the initial purge and allow survivors to rebuild. These were desperate measures, unlikely to succeed against protocols designed by the Emperor himself or those who'd stood at his side during the Unification Wars, but they represented agency in the face of predetermined destruction. The broader implications were even more disturbing. If every Space Marine chapter existed on conditional terms, perpetually one activation code away from forced suicide, then the entire structure of the Adeptus Astartes was fundamentally different than its public perception. They weren't the Imperium's elite defenders, granted autonomy in exchange for their service. They were leashed weapons, allowed to operate independently only because the leash was long and the controllers confident in their ability to pull it tight at any moment. Every chapter's pride, every fortress monastery's independence, every claim of ancient lineage and honor, all of it was theater, a comfortable fiction maintained so long as it served imperial purposes but ready to be dissolved the instant a chapter became more problematic than useful. Tychon had found records of chapters that had simply vanished, their names struck from imperial archives with no explanation beyond vague references to genetic failure or lost in the warp. 19 chapters during the War of the Beast. 43 during the Age of Apostasy. Hundreds across the millennia, each one potentially a terminus protocol activation, a weapon switched from active to destroyed because someone on Terra decided the risk outweighed the utility. The Firehawk's transformation into the Legion of the Damned, assuming the legends held any truth, might have been a terminus protocol that had gone wrong, killing the chapter's physical forms but somehow preserving their vengeful spirits. Or perhaps it had gone exactly as designed, creating something even more useful than living Space Marines. Ghosts bound to serve the Imperium throughout eternity, unable to rebel or question or refuse. The psychological burden of this knowledge was crushing. Every battle felt different when you knew that your chapter's existence was provisional, that somewhere in the fortress monastery's depths sat mechanisms designed to kill you and all your brothers should the distant powers deem it necessary. Tychon had watched the change spread through the Celestial Lion's leadership, seen the way brothers looked at their own fortress monastery's walls differently, wondering which sections contained the kill systems, which servitors might carry activation commands, which apparently standard equipment might transform into instruments of execution. Trust became complicated when you understood that your entire existence was structured around being disposable. Yet the knowledge also brought a strange clarity. Brother Captain Amati had articulated it during one of their clandestine gatherings in the chapter's meditation sanctum. "We always knew we were weapons," he'd said, his scarred face illuminated by candlelight that the fortress monastery's power systems should have rendered unnecessary. "We've spent our entire existence being pointed at the Imperium's enemies and told to kill until nothing remains. The Terminus protocols don't change what we are, they just reveal what we've always been. Weapons with kill switches, angels with strings. The only difference is now we know who holds them." There was peace in that understanding, Tychon realized. No more illusions about noble independence, no more pretense that their service was freely given rather than structurally enforced. They served because the alternative was activation, fought because survival required it, remained loyal because disloyalty meant systematic self-destruction. Some brothers had argued for rebellion, for attempting to unite multiple chapters in simultaneous protocol removal, gambling that the Imperium couldn't destroy dozens of chapters at once without crippling its own defenses. Tychon had been the one to explain why that would fail. The protocols weren't just in their gene seed and fortress monasteries, they were woven into the very support systems that kept chapters operational. The forge worlds that supplied their ammunition, the navigator houses that guided their fleets, the administrative bureaucracies that provided resources and intelligence, all of them were part of the control mechanism. A chapter that went rogue would find its supplies mysteriously delayed, its intelligence networks compromised, its ships developing navigation errors that stranded them in hostile sectors. The Imperium had 10,000 years to perfect the art of controlling its weapons, and the Terminus protocols were just the final guarantee, the ultimate sanction for when all other control mechanisms failed. The meeting where they discussed the protocols with the chapter's full command structure had lasted 3 days. By the end, every senior officer understood the reality of their existence, and each had made peace with it in their own way. Some retreated into faith, believing that the Emperor's wisdom justified any measure, even the potential extermination of loyal servants. Others embraced fatalism, accepting that death was always the likely end for a space marine, whether on the battlefield or through protocol activation. A few, like Tychon himself, found motivation in defiance. They would serve brilliantly, fight perfectly, ensure their chapter became so valuable that Terra would never dare activate their termination codes. It was a dangerous game, trying to make yourself indispensable to powers that had survived 10 millennia by ruthlessly eliminating anything that became too powerful or too independent. Chapter Master Ikeen had ordered the vault resealed, the data core returned to its hidden chamber, the knowledge compartmentalized among those who needed to know. Life in the chapter continued much as it always had: training, deployment, combat, victory, or death. But underneath the routine, every brother who knew about the Terminus protocols carried the awareness like a tumor, a piece of dark knowledge that colored every interaction with Imperial authorities, every visit from Inquisitors or Custodian Guard, every order that came from Terra. They were the Emperor's angels, humanity's defenders, the Imperium's greatest warriors. And they were also weapons with safeties, approved for use only so long as they remained controllable, their continued existence dependent on staying useful without becoming threatening. Tychon stood now in the same vault where he'd discovered the data core, having returned alone during the night cycle when most of the fortress monastery slept. The crystalline device still rested on its plinth, still bore the custodian seal, still contained within its matrices the detailed specifications for how the celestial lions could be destroyed from within. He placed his hand on its smooth surface, feeling the faint warmth that suggested it remained active, connected to systems he couldn't detect, perhaps even transmitting status reports to distant Terra. "We know what you are," he whispered to it, to the custodians who'd placed it here, to the High Lords who maintained these systems across 1,000,000 worlds. "We know, and we serve anyway. Not because we're fools, but because we're warriors. And warriors fight even when the war is rigged against them." He left the vault, sealing it behind him, and ascended to the fortress monastery's upper levels where dawn was breaking over the chapter's home world. Below him, in the training grounds, neophytes practiced combat drills, unaware that their gene seed carried kill codes, that their fortress monastery contained self-destruct mechanisms, that their entire existence was provisional. Perhaps that ignorance was mercy. Or perhaps Tychon thought it was just another layer of control, keeping the weapons sharp by ensuring they never questioned their purpose. Either way, the Celestial Lions would continue their eternal war, would fight the Imperium's enemies with the same ferocity they'd always shown, would bleed and die in battles across the galaxy. Because in the end, the Terminus protocols changed nothing about what needed to be done, only what it meant to do it. And meaning, Tychon had learned, was a luxury that Space Marines had never truly been allowed to afford. The secrets run deeper than gene seed flaws and feeding chambers, darker than memory wars and contingency planning. Every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium exists within layers of control mechanisms, each one designed to ensure that humanity's greatest defenders never become its greatest threat. From the flesh tithe that builds them to the kill switches that can destroy them, the Adeptus Astartes are weapons in the truest sense, powerful, essential, and fundamentally unable to choose their own purpose. The Imperium survives not through the loyalty of its defenders but through the architecture of their submission, through systems so comprehensive that even awareness of them provides no path to freedom. In the grim darkness of the far future, even angels must serve on borrowed time, their wings clipped by invisible chains, their glory purchased with secrets that would shatter the faith of those they protect. This is the truth behind every chapter's honor, the darkness that makes their light possible, the price of creating gods from the flesh of men who were never meant to know what they'd become.